Great things are rarely done alone. A special thank you to our 200th anniversary sponsors: Air Canada, Canadian Tire, Clearwater Seafoods, Lord Nelson Hotel and Suites, Michelin North America Canada Incorporated, Scotiabank, CBC, the Chronicle Herald, and the Globe and Mail. We are proud to recognize our ongoing partnerships. Thank you for your generous support.
Good evening. Thank you for being here this evening. It's wonderful to see such a great turnout for this evening's Belong Forum with Canadian Senator Murray Sinclair. We're going to have a more formal introduction from one of our great professors, Naomi Metallic. But let me just say here personally, on behalf of all of DAL, what an honor it is to host such an incredible individual and leader here at DAL tonight. And I know from chatting with Senator Sinclair that he receives hundreds and thousands of invitations. And so it's just wonderful that we've got him here with us tonight. And it's wonderful to see such a great turnout from our community. My name is Richard Florzone. I'm Dalhousie's 11th president, and I'm here with Elder Jane Abram from the Millbrook First Nation, who will provide a blessing to begin our event. But first, I'd like to begin by acknowledging that Dalhousie University is located in Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq, a reminder that we are all treaty people. With that, let me turn it over to Elder Jane to provide the blessing. Thank you, Elder Jane, for that blessing and for being with us here this evening and, frankly, for being with us every day with your presence at Dalhousie University with our other elders. I'd also like to share a special welcome on behalf of Dalhousie to all of our Indigenous elders and leaders who are here with us tonight. 2018 has been a special year for Dalhousie as we reflect on our past and look ahead to our third century. Our 200th year so far has been filled with events, with programs and performances across all of our faculties and campuses. It's been a great mix of academic and community events, and even across the country as our alumni bus travels from coast to coast. In fact, I'll be completing that in the coming weeks with visits to Charlottetown, St. John, and St. John's. And there's still more to come this fall. You know, from the beginning, 200 years ago, Dalhousie aspired to the highest academic standards and to be of service to all of our communities. 2 centuries later, we have grown from that, what was a little college by the sea, into a national university and the leading research university in Atlantic Canada. But we couldn't be where we are today without our people. Our history has been written, and it's been enriched by their identities, by their cultures, by their values, by their actions, and of course, by their teaching and scholarship. As we enter our third century, we are more committed than ever to creating an environment where all members of our community feel welcome, supported, and respected. Because that's the measure of a strong university, to be open and inclusive of all. Tonight's event is our latest installment in our Belong Forum series, which has been a centerpiece of the 200th year in our Year of Belonging. All year, as part of that speaker series, we've been asking the question, what will it take for us to create a world where we all feel like we truly belong? To help us think about this important question, we have brought several national and internationally respected changemakers to campus to share their unique perspectives. So we've had the privilege from hearing from Canadian Olympic champion and humanitarian Mark Tewksbury, which was greatly attended down at Citadel High School. Many of you were here in this very theater when we had iconic singer-songwriter and Indigenous activist Buffy St. Marie, or award-winning MIT historian and the Faculty of Management Craig Stephen Wilder speaking. In addition to tonight's forum with Senator Murray Sinclair, this fall we are going to hear from world-renowned animal scientist and autism advocate Temple Grandin, from U.S. civil rights trailblazer Angela Davis, and disability activist and former Paralympian Rick Hansen. We have all this and a lot more planned, and I hope you are excited as I am in the remaining months of DAL 200 to create an even more inclusive environment at Dalhousie. If you'd like to learn more about any of those events, including the Belong Forums, I encourage you to visit dal200.ca. It's now my pleasure to hand the microphone over to one of our fabulous young professors, Dalhousie law professor Naomi Metallic to the stage to introduce Senator Sinclair. Professor Metallic has devoted her career to advocating for Indigenous peoples, and I'm so proud that she is the first holder of Dal's Chancellor's Chair in Aboriginal Law and Policy at our Schulich School of Law. Please join me in welcoming Professor Metallic.
Good evening, everyone. It's an honor to be here tonight as part of this Belong Forum with Senator Murray Sinclair. For those of you who don't know me, I am Naomi Metallic, an assistant professor in the Schulich School of Law here at Dalhousie. I'm Mi'kmaq from the Listagouche Mi'kmaq First Nation located in the Geskabe-Wagi district of Mi'kmaqi. Some people call it Quebec. Epjalasi achweldasi begisin welag. Welcome, and I am so pleased to be here this evening. This event comes at a time that I find tough to describe. The quote, "It was the best of times, it was the worst of times," comes to mind, perhaps. On the one hand, there have been considerable setbacks for Indigenous communities this year. In February, there was the acquittal in the trial over the 2016 murder of 22-year-old Colton Boushie, a resident of the Cree Red Pheasant First Nation in Saskatchewan. Not long after that, a man charged with the 2014 murder of 15-year-old Tina Fontaine was also acquitted in a case that highlights the continued crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women in Canada. On the other hand, we have institutions like the federal government committing to the need for reform. And while some question the sincerity of this, or at least withholding judgment until they see concrete action, there is no question that reconciliation is a lens through which many conversations we are having today is filtered. There may be multiple definitions of reconciliation, not all of which are meaningful, but it is remarkable how often now the concept serves as a focal point in our conversations. And I don't think this would be happening if it were not for the work of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and its commissioners, including our esteemed guest this evening, Senator Sinclair, as well as all the residential school survivors who had the courage to seek justice. Senator Sinclair has shown tireless commitment to advocating on behalf of Indigenous people across the country, from his early days as a civil and criminal litigator and a co-commissioner on the Aboriginal Justice Inquiry in Manitoba, to his more recent work as chair of the TRC and as a Canadian senator. Please join me now in welcoming Senator Sinclair.
Oh, never mind. Stand up. Let's keep going. Bonjour, hello, all of my relatives. Mizanagijik, Indigenous, that's my name, Mizanagijik. Kingo Dodem, that's my clan. The fish clan, rainbow trout in particular. My wife's clan is the bear clan. You think I'm kidding, don't you? It really is. She really is Bear Clan. She says, in fact, that the fish only exist to feed the bear. So our relationship is an interesting one. But I just wanted to introduce myself to you in the appropriate way and tell you who I am, where I come from, where my family comes from. And thank you all for being here, and thank you for being part of this evening, and hopefully being, through your presence here and whatever that indicates to others, at least be willing to participate in a dialogue around the issue of belonging, reconciliation, resilience, and initiatives that bring all of those issues together. First of all, I want to apologize to you because that's not my best picture. It was when I was a judge, incidentally. That was my look. Yeah. I was a judge for 28 years, and I want you to know within the first 3 days of being a judge, one of my colleagues on the bench said, "You have to develop the look." When you are dealing with people who have done bad things, you have to develop the look. So I tried that. All I did was make them laugh, like it does with you. But I find it works with lawyers. So I only ever developed the look for lawyers when they were making submissions. So those of you who are in law school, that's what you're going to see. You're going to see that a lot. But I really do appreciate the kind introduction that Naomi gave me. I really do thank her for that. Introductions are always a bit of a challenge for me to sit through, to wait through, because sometimes they can go on and on and on. My CV runs to about 42 pages with all of the various things that I allege that I have done. And one time, in fact, at the University of Toronto, I was being introduced by a young law student who had my CV. At that time, it was only 12 pages long. And she said, in the introduction, she said, "I have Judge Sinclair's CV in front of me, and I'm not going to read it to you because it's too long, but I've read it, and I want you to know he's a well-rounded man." Now, I didn't take it as a personal comment upon the shape that I was in. I could have, but I didn't. I didn't. I learned to be kind. That's what my elders teach me. Learn to be kind. Because it is important. And the work that I did as a judge, and even as a lawyer, I've learned that kindness and respect will get you a lot more and accomplish a lot more than anything else that you do. I was recently having coffee at one of the shopping malls in Winnipeg, and sitting there reading one of the books on my iPad that I buy. During the TRC, for 7 years, I traveled the country listening to thousands and thousands of witnesses. I never had a chance to read a book for pleasure during that period of time, but I bought lots of books. And in particular, I bought lots of e-books and put them on my iPad saying, "I'm going to read this as soon as this is done." So I have about 3,000 books on my, on my iPad. So whenever I can, I try to read them. So I was reading one of them in the mall, having a coffee, and the security guard came over to me and sat down just in front of me, and he said, "Hi, how you doing?" And I thought, well, I didn't do anything wrong. So I said, "I'm doing fine, thank you. How are you?" He said, "Oh, I'm doing well." He said, just thought I'd stop in and say hi, and just want to tell you a little bit about my son. And I said, "Sure, go ahead." He said, "Well, my son is now just finished high school. He's going to university. He wants to study law. And I wonder if maybe one day when you're here, if you don't mind if I come and bring him to see you." And I said, "Well, I'm here usually on weekends and in the morning on Saturdays, and if you want to bring him by, I'll be glad to talk to him." And he looked at me and he said, "You don't remember me, do you?" And I said, "No, I'm afraid I don't." And he said, "Well, about 12 years ago, you sent me to prison for 8 years." And I said, "So how was that for you?" Because he looked like he was doing okay. And he said, at the time, he said, I was not really sure that I was going to get anything out of that, because prison's not a nice place for most people. He said, "But you said something to me when you were sentencing me that I never forgot." And I said, oh, what was that? He said, you said to me, because he was sentenced for breaking into a house and robbing the house, and then he hurt one of the owners as he was leaving. And so I sent him to prison for 8 years. And he said, you said to me, turn around and look at your son, because my son was in the courtroom. And so I did. And he said, you told me to look at him and tell him, you don't have to be like this. And so I told him that. And every time he was brought to visit with me in prison, that's what I said to him. You don't have to be like this. And so my whole life, he said, since then, has been about making sure that he doesn't have to follow in those footsteps that I made. And in fact, when I was in prison, he said I went to schools, I took classes, and I got a university degree. And then when I got out, I went to university and I got another degree. And I worked hard, got together with my family again, helped raise my son. He's now, as I said, a young teenager who wants to go to law. And he is helping his child, his son, to become a better person than he is. And that's what I think we all need to try to accomplish. So he said, I just want you to know that what you said was very important to me at the time. And I said, well, thank you for that. It's good to know that once in a while some of those things turn out. And I hear that from others occasionally, that something that I said or did or just how I treated people in the course of my work as a judge has had an impact on them. Because I think that's important. Don't you? I think the way that we treat people is important. Because when we ask ourselves the question, what does it mean to belong? We really do need to think about what is it that we can do to help people feel like they belong with us or where we're at. And what does it mean to belong? Well, that's a difficult concept originally to get your head around. It actually means to be a member of something, or in simple terms, but it's more than that. To belong means that you are part of something that's important to you, but it also means that that something that you belong to feels that you are important to them. So to belong is this mutuality of a sense of importance. We feel that we belong together. We feel that we are welcoming to each other. When you belong somewhere, it's like you're in a place of safety. You're in a haven. You are someplace where you don't have to worry about your back because somebody's watching it for you. You don't have to worry if you fall down because somebody will help you get up. You don't have to worry about going hungry because somebody will share food. So belonging means that there are people there who will help you, and there are people there who know that you will help them. Early on in the work of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, I said reconciliation is a very simple concept, and it is this: I want to be your friend, and I want you to be my friend. And if we are friends together, then everything that we do together will be done as one. That we will accomplish more together than we can accomplish separately. A reconciliation will mutually benefit each of us. And it's about that mutuality. But in order for us to get there, we have a lot of hurdles to overcome. We have a lot of history to overcome, because when you walk into a room, the first thing you look for is a welcoming face, right? You walk into a room of strangers, people you don't know. And how many of you here tonight? Well, you don't have to put up your hands because that might get you into trouble with the guy who's sitting beside you. But when you walk into a room, and it's true for me too, when I walk into a room, the the first thing I do is I look for a familiar face. I look for somebody I know, even though I know that there's nobody there that I know, but I look for somebody I know. And if I don't see somebody I know, then I look for somebody who's happy to see me. I look for somebody who's welcoming to me, who is giving signs of welcoming to me. And then that gives me a sense that I belong there, that we are together, that we are part of this circle, that we are part of this group. So this idea of belonging is an important one because it is what society is built upon. Society is built upon the idea that we belong to something together. We belong to this place. We belong to each other. We belong to the collective of us. And we are part of that collective. And because we are part of that collective, as a collective, we build something from that. We build a family, we build a community, we build a nation. And if we can do that, then from that, we get a sense of ourselves. We are part of this circle. We are part of this community. We are part of this nation. And I can take pride, along with all of you, that we have done this together. So belonging is important. And you now realize, I think, those of you who have been following the work that I have been involved in recently will know that for a long time now, Indigenous people have not felt like they belong in the same circles as the rest of Canada, because the history of our relationship has been about rejection. First of all, the Government of Canada, after Confederation, intervened so dramatically in the lives of Indigenous families to take away children and place them in institutions they called schools. They weren't schools, they weren't educational places. They were child welfare institutions established for the purpose of indoctrinating these children to become something other than they would have been if they'd stayed with their families, to drive their culture out of them, to drive their language out of them, to drive their identity out of them. So to take them away from the circle that they were part of, to take them away from the place where they belonged and they felt that they belonged, their family, their community, their nation, and to try to force them into a place that didn't want them. Another society, another nation, another community. Because at the same time as they were taking them and indoctrinating them into believing that their community, their society was bad because they were heathens, they were pagans, they were savages, they were also telling Canadians, we're saving these children from being heathens, pagans, and savages because that's what Indians are. And so the Canadians who were being asked to accept them as part of Canada were saying, well, we don't want them because they're heathens, they're savages, they're pagans. They're not worthy of us. They are not like us. And so, as Indigenous people, when those children left the school, going into the community to become part of Canadian society was never going to be in the cards. It was never going to work. It was never going to work. The American government realized that by the 1930s, after they established their boarding school system. They stopped doing that in the 1930s, but Canada persevered until the last residential school closed down in 1996. 1996, within the lifetime of all of you who are here, I think, except for maybe one or two. But within your lifetime, residential schools were continuing to do that. We're taking children away from their families. We're teaching them that they were heathens, they were savages, or they came from heathens, they came from savages. that they were unworthy because they had not yet been Christianized or civilized. And until they became civilized and Christianized, they would continue to be unworthy. And so they did that. Many embraced that evolution. They embraced Christianity. They embraced the idea of joining Canadian society. When the Second World War broke out, almost entire communities of men went to war for Canada, joined the army to go to war for Canada. I don't know how many veterans we have here, but there isn't a veteran who cannot tell you that they fought alongside Indigenous men in that war. My dad went to war, his brothers went to war, my uncles went to war, and every single man in my home community joined the army during the Second World War to fight for Canada because of this desire to belong, this desire to do something with their lives, this desire to be something. And yet, when they returned, they were told they could not have the same benefits that all the other veterans had. They had to go back to their communities. They had to go back to their families. They couldn't get veterans' allowances. They couldn't get veterans' pensions or medical benefits. They had to go to Indian Affairs and see the Indian agent and see what he would do for them, just like every other Indigenous person in Canada had to do. And so they were denied the same benefits that all of the other military men were receiving. So they didn't belong. And they resented it. They resented it greatly. I grew up in the era after the Second World War, in the 1950s. And I could feel that resentment growing up. I could sense it in the air when they talked about how their relationship with the government. You've got to remember that I grew up in the 50s when the adults in our community could not vote. They could not vote. They could go to war, they could be shot, they could be killed for the country, but when they came back, they not only couldn't get benefits, they couldn't even vote. And they were angry, they were upset, they were not happy. And that anger and resentment was taken out not on Canadian society, but upon their families, upon their communities, upon each other. Frantz Fanon, who's a noted sociologist, wrote in his book, The Wretched of the Earth, that those who have experienced colonization take out their frustration at the colonization treatment that they have experienced in three ways. Firstly, they take it out upon themselves. So they self-abuse. They drink alcohol, they use drugs, they harm themselves, they commit suicide. They refuse to go for medical treatment, they refuse to take care of themselves because they hate themselves. They swallow the poison, they drink the Kool-Aid, they believe what they're being told. And so that anger is taken out upon themselves. And then they take it out upon those around them. They take out their anger upon those who are close to them, their families, their spouses, their children, their neighbors, other men, other women, people within their community. That's the second round of violence. And then, he says, they will then start to take that violence and aggression out against the settler nation, against the colonizer. And that's then when things start to happen. And he was talking about the African colonization experience. And when you look at the experience of colonization in Africa, you can see exactly what he was talking about. He started writing about this in 1947. He published his work in 1960. And that phenomenon is now playing out in Canada. When you look around, you see that Indigenous youth are committing suicide at 8 to 10 times the rates of non-Indigenous kids. The highest suicide rates in the world are among the Indigenous population of North America, and Canada leads the way. Medical problems that are attributable to the fact that people are not taking care of themselves and taking care of their health. Not that they don't also lack services, but just because even when services are available, they don't take advantage of them because they don't respect themselves enough, are an incredible phenomenon. We have health problems that only third world countries experience. And look at where we're located, in Canada. Violence within Indigenous communities is rampant. Gangs are enjoying the benefit of that violence. Of course, drug abuse, alcohol abuse is prominent in many communities. Suicide rates is the highest that you've ever known, but suicide attempt rates are even higher than that. So people are not always succeeding, but they're constantly self-harming. And then on top of all of that, of course, is the fact that they're being criminalized. They're being sent to jail. They're losing their children to the child welfare system at even higher rates than the residential schools took their children away. And so when we talk about the issue of belonging, we have to recognize that even though this territory and all territories of this nation at one time were the territories of the various Indigenous nations, and they were here for thousands and thousands and thousands of years, and were able to take care of themselves quite well. Thank you very much. Now, look at us. The worst part of all of this is that Canadian children, non-Indigenous children in the public schools were taught the very same message. So when we look at the way that non-Indigenous leaders talk about and towards Indigenous people, it is from a position of a sense of superiority to people who are inferior. A sense of, we'll help take care of you because we're kind people, not a recognition of rights or a recognition of the inherent wrongs of past conduct. It is that because we're kind, we'll help you because you are in need of help. Never mind that we put you in need of help. We're not prepared to quite accept that responsibility yet. But don't be surprised then when you look at Indigenous youth continuing to self-harm, continuing to drop out of school, continuing to reject what Canadian society purports to offer them in such large numbers. And I know that there are exceptions. I know that there are people who, like me, work hard and successfully within Canadian society to become the achievers that we are, and those numbers are growing and growing, but still, the phenomenon is that most young Indigenous people, the majority of them, are falling prey to the depression, to the difficulties of believing that they are worthy of being part of this society, or even that they want to be, if they are worthy, to be part of this society. And yet they don't have another society that's worthy of their attention either. They don't want to be the kind of Indigenous person that this society has created. They don't want to be living a life of poverty. They don't want to be living a life of addiction. They don't want to be living a life of violence. They don't want to be living in the kind of housing with the kind of communities and the poor water supplies and the poor educational resources that we see out there. They don't want that. But they know that turning to this society to belong here is not in their cards either. Because we have a lot of work to do. We have a lot of work to change the way that we think about each other. We have a lot of work to accept the responsibility of those past misdeeds and those past judgments that we have put in place. and start to change the way that we think, we talk, and we act. And that's what our report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was about. People focus upon this idea of reconciliation and say, well, you know, let's reconcile, I'll do something nice for you, so let's consider that an act of reconciliation. Well, how about this? Why don't you just change the way you're thinking? Why don't you change the way you behave? Why don't you talk to your children when they say something bad? Or why don't you talk to them when something bad is shown on television, or a message is displayed through the movies or through books that is a negative stereotype of Indigenous people? Why don't you criticize those people who speak publicly about Indigenous people wanting to stand up for their rights, as though somehow there's something wrong with that? If the United States wanted to run a pipeline through Canada without our consent, you're damn right we'd all be out there fighting it from the word go, every single one of us, because they cannot come and take our territory and run it across our territory without our consent. And yet, we seem to think that if there are enough jobs that are at risk, then it's okay for us to do that to Indigenous territory, even though we have not yet come to terms with the rights of Indigenous people appropriately. We have a lot of work to do. And one of those things that we have to do is we have to come to understand that Canada has not yet figured out how to help Indigenous people regain their sense of belonging to their own communities by helping their own communities to reconfigure themselves into this modern day and age. And Canadian society hasn't figured out how to be accepting enough for Indigenous youth without almost requiring Indigenous people to give up their sense of identity. I have raised my children to believe that they have the right to be Anishinaabe, wherever they are. And even my granddaughter, who's now 12 years old, going on 68, she thinks she's an elder. Because she comes out with some beautiful words of wisdom. I was telling some of the crowd earlier that when I was appointed to the Senate, I'd been a judge for 30 years, and all of her life she'd only ever known me as a judge. So when I was appointed to the Senate, she said, Mushum, that's our word for grandfather, Mushum, come to my class so I can talk to the students about your new job. And I said, okay. So I went to her class, and she said, this is my Mushum, my grandfather. He used to be a judge, and she talked all about what judges do. He used to be a lawyer. She talked about what lawyers do. And she said, now he's a senator. And one of the little boys said, well, what does a senator do? And only as she can, she put her hand on her hip, and she looked at that young boy for about 5 seconds and stared him down and said, he sanitizes. So now you know what I do, right? But here's the key. Here's the key. It took us a long time to create this situation of disrespect. It took us a lot of hard work to create this problem that we have. And don't think of it as just Indigenous people's problem. This is a problem for Canadian society. Your children are still being educated in the public schools of this country, and your grandchildren and your great-grandchildren, if you're that old, are still being educated in the public schools of this country to believe in the mythology of European superiority and Indigenous inferiority, and we have to stop that. We have to stop that. And if we don't stop that, we're going to be having this conversation for many generations to come. and Frantz Fanon's prediction of that third wave of violence is going to come true, and truer with each passing year. We have to understand that. We have to see it. We have to believe it. And I know that many of you who are here, because you are here and you're not off somewhere else laughing about how all these idiots are listening to that senator and all of the BS that he's driveling on the floor. Because you are here, it is up to you to convince society that we need to change the way that we talk to and about each other. We really do. We have to be more welcoming. We have to create places of safety. We have to help Indigenous people want to belong, and we have to rethink our approach to what we are doing when Indigenous people want to reestablish their cultures, their languages, and their communities. Because the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People has said that in those countries where colonization has effectively worked to destroy the culture of Indigenous people, it has an obligation to work effectively to help those cultures to reinvigorate themselves. And young Indigenous people are looking for that. I say to you that when it comes to the issue of Indigenous youth suicide, I don't think of it as a mental health problem. I think of it as an identity problem. I think of it as a lack of an ability to see where they belong. And remember that all of us need to be able to answer 4 questions as we're growing up. Where do I come from? Where am I going? Why am I here? And who am I? And education should teach all of us how to answer those questions. Our history, our creation stories, our culture, our future, our teachings of life hereafter, and our understanding of our responsibilities today will all help us to understand who we are. And if we can help Indigenous youth to gain that or regain that, then this will be the country that you and others all think it is, but it isn't. So thank you very much.
Why don't we get comfortable on the chairs over here?
All right.
Wasn't that fantastic, folks? Delightful. Have a seat, sir. My name is Tom Murphy. I'm co-host of the CBC Separara News here in Nova Scotia. And I think I'm probably like you. I was pretty impressed by what I heard here this evening. A warm individual, perhaps belying the photograph that you alluded to earlier, for sure. Entertaining, but I think we'll all agree, insightful. And just a pleasure to listen to that, and we really do appreciate it. But we're going to put you to work. You're going to take some questions from the floor. I hope you're up for that.
Well, you can ask the questions. You may not get the answers you want.
We shall see.
All right.
There are a couple of microphones on the floor in the aisleway here right now. And I know the Indigenous leaders have taught us that, these conversations can't be had about us without us. So in keeping with that spirit, we'd like to have the first questions come from people from the Indigenous community. So I'd ask you to come to the microphone. Do not delay, because we have about 20 minutes for this Q&A session. So that time will go by pretty quickly, I think. So if you can quickly come to the microphone with a question, we'll get things started. And right on cue, there's our first question. Sir, go ahead.
Hello. Thank you again, Senator, for being here. We met earlier, and so my name's Aaron Prosper. I'm president of the Dalhousie Student Union, and I'm from Eskazoni First Nation. And so I've followed a lot of your work through my high school, and one of the things that always stood out to me is your comments around the Indian Act and the difficulty for Canada to exist without the Indian Act, and all the work we have left to do to become independent from that Indian Act and from that act. And so my question is, knowing the work that's still needed to dismantle the Indian Act, how do we move forward? How do we give Indigenous people belonging when we have the Indian Act in place? And so, the Indian Act for a lot of us, takes away a lot of rights, but how do we move forward when the Indian Act is still in place? So thank you.
That's the big question that is permeating the halls of Parliament and has been for at least 2 generations now, going back to when I was a young lawyer in the 1970s. We had a number of discussion groups and research pieces that were done on self-government and self-determination and doing away with the Indian Act. And the one thing I can tell you is that I don't think there's really anybody who is fighting hard to keep the Indian Act in place. There really isn't. Nobody wants it. Even the government itself doesn't want the Indian Act. The problem is that they can't agree on what to replace it with, or whether it needs to be replaced at all, or they can just let the common law or the legal principles that were in place before Confederation, which allowed Indigenous communities to flourish and exercise their own rights in accordance with their own practices before this country was confederated in 1867, whether that's achievable, and we can go back to that. But I point out that, even if we did away with the Indian Act and didn't replace it with anything, we still have an interesting legal document that I think we could rely upon that would be useful for us to examine more fully, and that's the Royal Proclamation of 1763. In the Royal Proclamation of 1763, the new regime that took over after the French-English War, it ended in 1761 or 1760, promised the Indigenous community that if you do not attack our settlements, then we will not interfere with your internal operations. We will not interfere with your territories. You can continue to function as you have been heretofore. So all of the Indigenous nations were made that promise, and in 1764, they were Indigenous leaders, about 3,800 of them, were brought together at Niagara, at Fort Niagara, and the provisions of the Royal Proclamation were explained to them. That their right to self-government, their right to do things in accordance with their customs and their traditions would continue unchallenged and uninterrupted. Which is why when you look at the post-Confederation treaties, there is no self-government clause. There is no clause within the treaties that were signed with Indigenous people that deal with any of the things that were addressed in the Royal Proclamation, and it's because the Indigenous leadership didn't want anything in there about that. They had the promise in the Royal Proclamation, which they had passed down from generation to generation through their discussions, and so that was always their understanding, that they would continue to be able to function as they always had been. And within the legal regime that Canada was establishing, within the Confederation. And I think that's a starting point for this dialogue to occur, that we shouldn't think about what kind of Indian legislation do we want, other than this perhaps. I think we need Indigenous legislation that puts limits upon what the government can do. Because the problem is that despite what you may think, the government of Canada has a pretty poor corporate memory.
I think they might be agreeing with you there.
Am I telling you anything I'm telling you what you already know, right? So from one election to the next election, the people who are governing, they don't follow any previous commitments that were made or any previous understandings or agreements that were made unless they're legally bound to by the courts and legally required to. So I think that's an important principle for us to start with. And we do have constitutional relationship that is contained in Section 35 of our Constitution, but also is part of the Royal Proclamation. So I think we've got enough legal tools in place. I think the problem is that we haven't had a discussion about what those legal tools are. The main discussion has always centered upon what do we replace the Indian Act with? And I think we should say, well, let's just get rid of it. It's like, it's like having a marriage contract in place that neither of us wants, but we still want to live together and have kids. So let's get rid of it and just stay together and have kids.
Okay, we'll get ready for another question here. I should suggest to you folks in the balcony there, if you do have a question, you are free to come down to come to one of the microphones to ask it. So please do that.
Yeah, just don't come over the front edge.
Take the stairs down if you don't mind. And we'll sort of alternate between microphones here. Ma'am, if you'd like to go.
Great. Hi, GCM, for your being here today. We had a conversation earlier, and I definitely appreciate that. My name is Katie George Jim, and I'm from the Sauk Nation on southern Vancouver Island. My given name is Okwiswacha, given to me by my grandmother. And I really appreciate everything that you talked about today. And the question is kind of in regards to meaningful reconciliation and meaningful action. And I think for us to be in this institution today, I think it would be a missed opportunity if we didn't get to talk about how institutions like post-secondary colleges and universities can do their part in enacting TRC recommendations, as well as meaningful steps to incorporate not only Indigenous knowledge, but Indigenous decision-making opportunities, as well as for students, faculty, and community members in general. And so perhaps from your experience and your knowledge working within and out of Indigenous and non-Indigenous places of knowledge, talking about how we can integrate both understandings of the world and encourage and empower Indigenous youth to also be a part of seeking knowledge from both places. It's kind of a long question, but it's talking kind of mostly about how we can work together towards a better future in or outside our local community.
Oh yeah, sure.
That might take a while.
There's probably 100,000 consultants out there right now. I'm about to put out of work, so let me begin by saying that the problem that we need to begin with when it comes to the issue of education is to understand that though we have said education is the key to reconciliation in the TRC report, and I continue to believe that, we have to understand that education has been a primary tool of assimilation historically, and even today continues to be. And we need to change the way that we approach the issue of education. Education is really largely been designed in the last 25 to 35 years, has largely been designed to serve the needs of the of industry, so that those of you who are getting an education, from the moment you enter probably middle school, maybe junior high and high school, your career options are being pushed towards you to look at becoming doctors, lawyers, engineers, architects, people who have a role to play in the way that society functions as in terms of the industrial role of things. We are not educating our children to be thinkers. We're not educating our children to be people who simply are able to help become leaders in society. Leadership almost occurs by default or despite the educational system. And so one of the things that I've admired about some of the schools, for example, that have taken the work of the TRC seriously is that they're now beginning to teach children how to talk to each other, how to behave respectfully, how to be good people, how to be good characters, how to emulate the kinds of characteristics that we might have learned from our families in the past but seem not to be getting anymore, or to overcome the influence of the internet age that seems to encourage other kinds of behaviors. So preparing our children for that kind of lifestyle is part of what the educational system needs to undertake. And instead of focusing so much upon producing more people to work in industry or to work for industry and to serve the needs of the capital structure of our society. And I think as if we were to do that, we would still end up with, you know, with lawyers and doctors and people, but they'd be smarter and kinder people. And so I think we need to understand that education to force people into to assimilate or to direct them to become assimilated into the way that society wants to structure itself is something that we should discourage the public school system, the public schools of this country from doing, and encourage them, in fact, to teach our children to be more free thinkers and to be more able to address their development as human beings. And in later years, of course, they can, through their own choosing, decide that they want to become one of those other functional people that we talk about. But we need to understand that those who function in those various careers would be able to do them better.
Okay, Sarah, your turn.
Hello. I'm really glad to see you here. I've been looking forward to this. I was looking forward to this from the first time you were supposed to come, and there was some conflicts, and very happy, very glad that you're here, and I'm still a student here. My name is Milkigna Jijamishjinu. I'm from the Baitak Jakatar Nation from Newfoundland. And one of the things that I'm finding very difficult is the whole embracing of the traditions that go back before the settlers arrived. And I think a lot of people have a hard time embracing the possibility of the pipe and the tobacco. I think tobacco is a really big issue because I think a lot of people see how the results of tobacco being abused, but I don't think that they understand the balance of how strong tobacco is and how much good it can do. Maybe if you could say something around the importance of traditions, the old ways, and maybe we can find those of us that are traditional can find a little bit of healing within these institutions.
Okay, thank you for that.
Thank you. It's a good question. And I think that what you've raised and what you've highlighted in your question is the fact that there are many people out there who purport to understand our traditions and our culture and our past who have no idea what the hell they're talking about. And I think you need to be careful about these plastic elders that are doing this kind of thing out there because they're dangerous. The American Indian movement, incidentally, at one time ran a website in which they named these fake elders and put them up and identified them because they were causing so much damage within the Indigenous community because they were making up teachings solely for the purpose of men taking advantage of women or taking advantage of other people to get their money and to get their property. And we have to understand that there are shysters out there who are going to do those kinds of things. So the real key, the real question is who is it that should be mandated to be doing that kind of work. And let me point out to you that in the Navajo Nation, they came across this problem early on, and going back about 30 years now, or 40 years maybe, into the 1970s, they decided that nobody could practice traditional healing and traditional cultural practices in the Navajo Nation. And that's a nation of about 600,000 indigenous people. Nobody could practice indigenous medicine or indigenous healing or indigenous cultural traditions unless they got permission from indigenous elders of the Navajo Nation. And so, in effect, you have to get a practicing license to be an elder in the indigenous community in the Navajo country. And I think we need to go there. I think we really do need to ask those elders that we all can agree upon, who have that responsibility, that knowledge, and that ability to protect those things for us, to come together to establish those rules of engagement for us. Because if we leave it to a free-for-all, then we're going to end up with dirty fighters. And let's remember that that's not what we want. That's going to hurt us. And so right now we have a serious problem going on out there where our young people who are searching badly to find their identity are going to the wrong people in many cases. And I have a suspicion, quite frankly, that our young people who are dying and our young women who are going missing are victims of those kinds of phenomena. And I think we need to be cognizant of the possibility that that's at play here. And I don't have any strong evidence about it. I just think that it's such a wide open and uncharted territory that we need to take it seriously.
Okay, interesting point there.
Thank you.
Thank you for the question, a good one indeed. Okay, you're next.
Hi, my name is Sarah, and I'm not actually Indigenous. I'm very Caucasian. And
But it doesn't matter, you know why? Because my granddaughter's name is Sarah. So right now,
You're in.
right now, you are so in with me that you can say and ask me anything you want. Okay? And in fact, if you want a car, all you have to do is let me know, and I'll talk to your parents for you.
one, I want to thank you for coming here and speaking to us. I learned a lot. I've studied a lot of different cultures and religions, mainly so I'm very aware and very open. And my main question is, mainly as a non-Indigenous person, especially as a white person, how can I help speak out and make sure that Indigenous people are heard? And basically speak out about injustice that's happening.
It's a good question.
That's a very good question, and I want you to know that's a question I get asked a lot by non-Indigenous people. What can I do to help? What can I do that won't make things worse? And and to a certain extent, the way that I answer it depends upon who I'm talking to. So because your name is Sarah, I'll be kind. But let me say this, that the one thing that Indigenous people really do need to understand and know is that they have the answers for themselves. They don't need white people helping them. They need white people getting out of the way. And I'm sorry for those of you that are offended at the term white people, but that's the short term of who we're talking about here, so let's just go with it. But the reality is that Indigenous people have for the longest time been so oppressed by Canadian society through law, but also through social and institutional practices, that they have come to not believe in themselves. And so if you are a teacher, then the one thing you can do is to talk to Indigenous children in your classroom and say, you have this knowledge available to you. Talk to your mother, talk to your aunties, talk to your uncles, talk to your dad, talk to your grandfathers. they will help you learn this. It comes from them, not from me, from them. And I want you to know, incidentally, that one of the most important pieces of advice that I ever got about learning my identity was when I was a young air cadet on an international exchange program, and I stayed with a family named Eastoe in England, and the father of the family's name was David Eastoe, and David used to sit and talk to me, and he'd ask me all sorts of questions about what it meant to be Indigenous, and I was only 17 at the time, and I said, you know, a lot of the questions you're asking me, I don't know the answers to because I wasn't raised in that environment. I didn't know my culture. I don't know my language. And he said, you know, you have to go and find that out for yourself. You have to go and talk to your people and find out what are the answers to these questions. And so that's what I've been doing. I've been embarked on this journey now for over 50 years, but I worked on it most seriously when my son was born in 1976. And then it became important, really important. So for non-Indigenous people, it's not just, it isn't only a question of getting out of the way, because you do have to get out of the way sometime, but it's also a question of wait until you're asked. They will ask you to help. And when they ask you to help, be there for them. But the other thing you need to do is, when you have to, you got to step in front of another non-Indigenous person who is bad-mouthing all of this and deal with them, because they won't listen to even guys like me, unless I'm
on the bench.
You know, and by then, you know, by then I'm so angry that I don't know what I would do. But the one thing that we do need to understand is that non-Indigenous people need to control the racists within their society. You really do.
Okay, thank you very much for the question, by the way. We're getting to run out of time here. I'm going to get one more from the microphone here, and sir, you have it. Go ahead.
Hello. I noticed you showed disdain towards a Trans Mountain pipeline previously. I would also like to, I admire how collectively the Indigenous community rallies against our destructive actions against the environment. I would like to ask a question about trade policy and what your thoughts are on the Trans-Pacific Partnership, a trade policy that would increase decrease the majority working class people's decision in our economy in shifting towards a select few on top making all those decisions.
Oh, sure, get me in trouble with everybody in Ottawa. The problem with the international trade agreements, and I've had this conversation with various officials within government, the problem with the negotiation of international trade agreements in Canada's recent past has been that they have not consulted with and involved Indigenous leaders in that dialogue, and they need to. Because Indigenous leaders have certain inalienable rights that come from their inherent sovereignty as Indigenous nations. And those rights need to be recognized and need to be protected and need to be part of those kinds of international trade agreements. There is an international trade agreement that Canada does not officially recognize that in fact provides for rights for Indigenous people, and that's the Jay Treaty. The Jay Treaty says that Indigenous people have the right to go back and forth across the American-US border for trade reasons. They can take their trade goods into the US. The United States government will let you do that. They recognize and honor the Jay Treaty. But they can also, under the Jay Treaty, bring their own trade goods or other trade goods into Canada to benefit their community or to benefit the country or for sale. Canada does not allow that to happen. And so if Canada is serious about international trade and enhancing and protecting the rights of Indigenous people, start with the law that now exists, and let's work from there.
Okay. Thank you very much. Okay, somebody is pleading at this microphone, so we'll make this our last question. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom.
Okay.
Hello, Senator. My name's Rana Zaman, and I'm a social activist who happens to be Muslim, and you know everything that's happening there. My question is, how do we create true solidarity and address, because I believe in my heart, if we address reconciliation and as a nation, bring our Indigenous family together and become a family, we will be uplifted as a nation and then be more caring and giving and understanding of other minorities as well. But how do we create that solidarity, and how do we get it to the government level, who at the end, no matter how many voices here speak up, we can't make them change anything until they decide to make those changes.
Okay, so from international trade, we now go to international peace treaties. So let me respond this way. When we talk about, first of all, the first part of your question was about how do we talk about the possibility of Muslim people and Indigenous people developing a mutuality in terms of their relationship? Is that what you asked?
That mutuality is already there because of, I call it that we're the new flavor of people being discriminated against or stereotyping or government rhetoric. The reality is, I believe all minorities have gone through a phase. I don't know what it is about Canada, starting with our Indigenous, our Black community, the Francophone community, the Irish community, the Japanese community, the Jewish community, like, there's no end. But how do we change that? Like, how do we bring people together? Like, we don't need to hate on the other. How do we bring true solidarity? I believe it'll happen by addressing the Indigenous concerns first, because that's where the disunity began.
Well, I don't know that one comes before the other, so let me begin by that. But I think what is important is for us to understand that the various communities that you've been talking about are, it is important for them to work in solidarity with each other in order to protect and support each other as they advance, go forward, because within Canadian society there are forces of resistance that all of them will experience in common. And forming a solid wall together, forming a relationship together allows them to deal with that. And I think that begins by the leadership of each community talking to each other. It needs to be done on a sovereign to sovereign sort of basis. And that's the way historically it would have always been done, and I think we should understand the importance of that. I think as well, in terms of just social phenomenon within neighborhood communities, how do people within neighborhoods work together? And quite frankly, and I don't know how I can say this without sounding sexist, but I always believe that if the mothers get together and talk about a solution that will be best for their children, then that's the best solution that can be worked out. Because I've seen it happen in communities where the men, for whatever reason, can't and won't talk to each other, but the mothers are able to put aside those kinds of differences that keep men apart, but the mothers can talk to each other and can develop an agreement. And I've actually mediated agreements using the women of the community as the primary instigators of relationship building. So,
Thank you.
Interesting. Okay. I'm sorry, we will have to leave it there. We've been asked to try and keep it as close to 20 minutes, and we're well, I'm happy to do that. If our organizers, I'm sure they're fine with that. They're waving at me at the wings here. We have one more at the microphone.
Thank
Let's
you.
have that, sure.
Dawn Tabobin from Wisconsin First Nation, Ontario. All what you're talking about is suppression on our people. What can we do with our own people on our own First Nations suppressing us? What can we do to help stop that?
Well, that's a very good question, because I think that I have seen across the country instances of Indigenous people in positions of authority who are ignoring members of their community or deliberately excluding members of their community and sometimes, in fact, being very destructive towards other members of their community because of religious differences or family differences or historical differences that they themselves don't understand and can't identify. But it's like the old feud between the Hatfields and the McCoys. Nobody knows how it got started, but damn, they're sure going to make sure it continues. The reality there, I think, is that communities sometimes have been forced together by a government when putting them together was not the appropriate thing to do at the start. We have seen the reserve creation process being abused by government, where they've literally pushed people to live on the same area of land who historically were never part of the same community. And so understanding that history and whether that's part of the history of the disagreement or the oppression is important to get to, but finding out the source of that, I think, is part of it. But in communities where political oppression comes about simply because of the will of a few people who are mean-spirited, unkind, and disrespectful, means that the solution needs to be to address that within those people or within those who come along after them. So there's no easy solution. You know, I can't tell you that I got a magic wand here, I'll take it over there for you, but I've seen it happen and I know exactly what you're talking about.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. Okay, Senator Sinclair, thank you very much for your comments, the opening comments, and taking the questions. I think we could be here for a long time tonight to answer or have a conversation. Maybe that can continue after the official function here this evening. But
incidentally, I brought a 42-page speech I was going to read to you. I don't get to read it to you anymore, I guess.
Well, it's fantastic because you spoke from the heart tonight. You didn't have a written word, and that, I think, speaks volumes. So it's been a pleasure to share the stage with you tonight and have you here in Halifax. Thank you for coming. I hope you feel like you belong in Halifax.
Can I tell you a little story? Just a short story, because I love my granddaughter so much. I always tell this story at this point in the event when I'm speaking, because my granddaughter Sarah is developed into a wonderful public speaker herself, and she's in a French immersion program, so she does her speeches in French. And so when she's developing a speech or writing a speech, she calls me and asks me to help, and I do. And so at her last one, she won the citywide championship or debate, whatever it's called, speech competition for her grade level. But as she was preparing, we went through the speech, and I said, everything's okay, it looks good, and it was all in French. And she said, now, Musham, I need to know, at the end of the speech, how do you get them to stand up?
Okay, folks, you can teach her how to do that, I think. You did it here tonight. Before you folks leave, we're going to call out from Dalhousie University students Marissa Prosper and Madison Joe to provide some closing remarks.
Thank you so much, Tom and Senator Sinclair. My name is Marissa Prosper, and I'm a Mi'kmaq from Pictou First Nation.
And my name is Madison Joe, and I'm from Membertou First Nation in Cape Breton.
We are both second-year students at Schulich School of Law, and we are both part of Dalhousie Indigenous Law Student Association, where I serve as co-president and Madison is our second-year representative. We are truly honored to be a part of this event with you tonight, Senator Sinclair. Your work as a lawyer, senator, and advocate for Indigenous rights in Canada has been instrumental in shaping our country's journey towards reconciliation. You've been an inspiration to me and so many others looking to continue that mission. And I think I speak for everyone here tonight when I say you have given us much more to think about and to discuss.
Senator Sinclair, on behalf of Dalhousie University, it is my pleasure to present you with this gift, a blanket made from the wool from the sheep at Dalhousie's Faculty of Agriculture.
Really? All right. Wonderful. Jonas, Tom. Jonas. Thank you very much.
Guaranteed to keep you warm,
Thank you
Senator.
very much.
Guaranteed to keep you warm.
So I get to sleep with a Dalhousie sheep. Wow.
Thank you again, Senator Sinclair, for joining us tonight and sharing your experience and insights with us. And I want to thank you for putting into words how many of us as Indigenous people around the country feel. So thank you for doing that. And lastly, I'd like to thank everyone in this room for coming out tonight. It is great to see such an amazing audience and have an amazing turnout for this event. It is great to have such great conversations being started. You can find out more about our Fall Belong forums and the other upcoming DAL 200 events at dal200.ca. We invite you now to join us for a post-event reception in the lobby of the building, just outside the doors of the atrium. Thank you and good night.
Thank you.